My name is Joaquin Vasquez, and I owned a food truck in Phoenix until 3 days ago when the world ended. I survived the first 72 hours of the zombie outbreak by making impossible choices that cost me friends and nearly my sanity. What I'm about to tell you will change how you think about survival, trust, and what it really takes to stay human when everything falls apart. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comments section. Below, perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. 3 days ago, I was Joaquin Vasquez, owner of Abuela's Kitchen on Wheels, the most popular food truck in Phoenix. Today, I'm just another survivor trying to make sense of how the world ended in 72 hours. What I'm about to tell you happened exactly as I remember it. Because when you watch society collapse in real time, every detail burns itself into your memory forever. I had been running my food truck for 12 years, hitting the same 3 hospital routes every day. 5 in the morning, I'd fire up the grill in my commissary kitchen, load up the truck with fresh carnitas, chorizo, and my grandmother's secret salsa recipe. By 6:30, I was parked outside St. Mary's Hospital downtown, serving breakfast burritos to the night shift nurses heading home, and the day shift doctors grabbing coffee before rounds. It was a good life, predictable, and I took pride in feeding the people who saved lives for a living. My Uncle Carlos always said I was too trusting, too willing to believe that the world would keep spinning the same way forever. He was one of those guys who stockpiled canned goods and kept emergency radios in every room of his house. Growing up, I thought he was paranoid, always talking about how society was just 3 missed meals away from total chaos. He insisted I install an emergency radio in my truck, one that could pick up police, fire, and military frequencies. I humored him because he was family, but I never thought I'd actually need it. The news had been weird for about a week before everything happened. Reports of some kind of flu outbreak in Seattle, then Denver, then Dallas. The CDC kept saying they had it under control, that it was just a particularly aggressive strain that was making people delirious before they recovered. I remember thinking it was just another media panic, like bird flu or swine flu, something that would blow over in a few weeks. But my regular customers at the hospitals had been acting strange. Dr. Patterson, who ordered the same black coffee and breakfast burrito every Tuesday for 6 years, hadn't shown up in 4 days. Maria Gonzalez, the pediatric nurse who always asked about my family back in Tucson, had called in sick 3 times in the past week. When I asked the other nurses about it, they just shrugged and said half the staff was coming down with something. Tuesday morning, October 15th, started like any other day. I was at St. Mary's by 6:30, setting up my usual spot in the parking lot near the emergency room entrance. The early morning air was crisp for Phoenix in October, and I could see my breath as I prepped the grill. The first customers were always the night shift security guards grabbing coffee before they headed home. That's when I noticed the ambulances. In 12 years of working hospital routes, you get used to the rhythm of emergency vehicles. Usually you'd see maybe 3 or 4 ambulances during the morning rush. That Tuesday I counted 8 in the first hour, and they were coming fast, sirens screaming, drivers looking like they'd seen something that shook them to their core. The EMTs weren't acting normal either. Usually they'd joke around while unloading patients, taking their time with the paperwork. That morning, they were rushing, almost frantic, getting their patients inside as quickly as possible and then standing outside afterward, chain smoking and talking in hushed voices. A couple of them looked like they'd been in fights, with scratches on their arms and torn uniforms. Around 7:30, I was serving breakfast to Janet, one of the ER nurses I'd known for years. She looked exhausted, more than usual, and when I asked if she was okay, she just shook her head and said the overnight shift had been unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Before I could ask what she meant, we heard screaming from inside the hospital. Not the normal kind of hospital screaming that you hear when someone's in pain or scared about a procedure. This was different, raw and primal, the kind of sound that makes every animal instinct in your body tell you to run. Janet dropped her burrito and sprinted toward the hospital entrance, her training kicking in even though I could see the fear in her eyes. I turned off my grill and stepped around to the front of my truck to get a better look at the hospital entrance. The automatic doors kept sliding open and closed as more people rushed inside, but I could hear the screaming getting louder, more voices joining in. Then I saw Maria Gonzalez, the pediatric nurse I'd been worried about, burst through those glass doors like something was chasing her. Her scrubs were torn and soaked with blood, not the small spatters you might see from a medical procedure, but deep red stains across her chest and arms. She was running faster than I'd ever seen anyone run, her face twisted in absolute terror, shouting something in Spanish that I couldn't make out, over the sound of car alarms that had started going off throughout the parking lot. Behind her, moving through those same glass doors, came Dr. Patterson. I'd served him coffee just the day before, a quiet man in his 50s who always asked about my grandmother's recipes. But the thing walking out of that hospital wasn't Dr. Patterson anymore. His throat was torn open, revealing muscle and bone underneath, and his white coat was drenched in dark blood that was definitely not his own. His eyes were completely white, rolled back so far that no iris or pupil was visible, just blank white orbs that seemed to look right through everything. But the worst part was how he moved. It was wrong, jerky, and unnatural, like a marionette, being controlled by someone who didn't understand how joints were supposed to work. Yet despite the awkward gait, he was fast, covering ground with a determination that made my stomach drop. I watched Dr. Patterson follow Maria's path across the parking lot, his head tilting side to side like he was listening for something. Maria had stopped running and was pressed against a car about 50 feet from my truck, trying to catch her breath and looking back at the hospital entrance. That's when Dr. Patterson's head snapped in her direction, and he changed course like a bloodhound that had caught a scent. Maria saw him coming and started running again, but she was exhausted and he was gaining ground fast. I wanted to help, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in my truck and drive away as fast as possible. Before I could make a decision, Dr. Patterson caught up to her. What happened next is burned into my memory forever. He grabbed Maria's shoulder and spun her around, and instead of speaking or asking if she was okay, he bit down on her neck with a savagery that no human being should possess. Maria's scream cut through the morning air like a blade, and I could see blood spraying as she tried to fight him off. 2 security guards came running out of the hospital, but they stopped dead when they saw what was happening. One of them, a guy named Rick who ordered fish tacos from me every Friday, pulled out his radio and started calling for backup. The other guard, younger and apparently newer, tried to approach Dr. Patterson to pull him off Maria. Dr. Patterson released Maria and turned on the young guard faster than should have been possible. The kid didn't have time to react before those teeth were sinking into his forearm. Rick was backing away now, his radio chatter becoming more frantic, calling for police and medical assistance, and repeating that they had multiple people down, in the parking lot. That's when I understood that whatever was happening wasn't isolated to Dr. Patterson. More figures were emerging from the hospital entrance, all moving with that same unnatural gait, all with the same white eyes and blood-stained clothing. Hospital staff, patients still in their gowns, visitors who had been there to check on loved ones. They were all wrong, all moving like predators who had caught the scent of prey. I backed toward my truck, fumbling for my keys while trying to keep my eyes on the growing crowd of what I was starting to realize weren't people anymore. The emergency radio Uncle Carlos had insisted I install was crackling with chatter, voices overlapping as dispatchers tried to coordinate responses to what sounded like similar incidents happening all across the city. The police arrived within minutes, 3 patrol cars screaming into the hospital parking lot with lights flashing. I felt a moment of relief, thinking that trained professionals would know how to handle whatever was happening. The officers got out of their cars with confidence, hands on their weapons but not drawn, approaching the situation like it was a standard disturbance call. The first officer who tried to restrain one of the infected learned the same lesson as the hospital security guard. These things didn't respond to commands or threats. They didn't seem to feel pain when the officers used their tasers. They just kept coming, focused entirely on biting and tearing at anything that moved. Within minutes, the parking lot had become a war zone. More infected were pouring out of the hospital, and several of the people who had been bitten were starting to change. Maria was still alive, pressed against the car where Dr. Patterson had attacked her. But I could see that the bite on her neck was already looking wrong. The wound wasn't bleeding the way it should have been, and her skin around it was taking on a grayish color. I climbed into my truck and started the engine, but I couldn't bring myself to drive away. These were people I'd known for years, customers who had become friends, medical professionals who dedicated their lives to helping others. Even as I watched them turn into something monstrous, part of me kept hoping that this was all some kind of hallucination, that I'd wake up and find myself back to worrying about running out of carnitas before lunch. The emergency radio was painting a picture that made my blood run cold. Similar incidents were being reported at hospitals across Phoenix, then across Arizona. Then I started hearing radio chatter from emergency services in New Mexico and California. The CDC wasn't calling it a flu outbreak anymore. The military was being called in for support. Phrases like unprecedented aggressive behavior and biting incidents were being repeated over and over. I spent the rest of that first day barricaded in my truck, watching the hospital parking lot fill with more of the infected and listening to civilization crumble over the radio waves. The police had retreated after losing half their officers to bites, and the fire department wasn't responding to calls in the area anymore. By afternoon, the hospital was completely overrun, and smoke was starting to rise from several parts of the building. As night fell, I realized that the morning's flu outbreak reports had been covering up something much worse. The infected were drawn to noise and movement, but they seemed to lose interest in things that stayed perfectly still. My truck's thick walls and small windows were keeping me safe for now, but I could see infected wandering through the parking lot, occasionally stopping to investigate cars or scratch at doors. The radio chatter was becoming more organized as emergency services adapted to what they were dealing with. I learned that the infection spread through bites, that the incubation period was usually between 1 and 4 hours, and that the only way to stop one of the infected was severe trauma to the head. The military was setting up containment zones around major population centers, but reports suggested they were being overwhelmed as quickly as they could establish perimeters. My food supplies would last maybe 2 days if I was careful, and the truck's water tank was half full. I had enough propane to run the cooking equipment for several days, and Uncle Carlos had insisted I install solar panels the previous year to reduce my dependence on generator power. The truck was more self-sufficient than most people's homes, but it wasn't built for a siege. As I sat in the dark, trying to conserve battery power while monitoring the radio, I started thinking about Uncle Carlos's paranoid rantings over the years. He always said that when society collapsed, people would turn on each other within days. The guy with food and supplies would become a target. Mobility would be more valuable than any fortress. Trust would become the deadliest luxury. Around midnight, I heard voices outside the truck. Human voices, speaking in hushed tones, trying not to attract the infected that were still wandering. The parking lot. I could make out at least 2 people, maybe 3, and they sounded desperate. Part of me wanted to help, but Uncle Carlos's warnings echoed in my head. How could I tell the difference between survivors who needed help and people who would kill me for my supplies? I listened to them for almost an hour, debating whether to make contact. They were trying to get into the hospital, talking about medicine they needed for someone who was sick. Their voices were strained with exhaustion and fear, and I could hear at least one woman crying softly. Eventually, they moved away, presumably finding another way into the building or giving up entirely. The guilt of not helping them ate at me for the rest of the night, but by morning I could see why they had been so desperate. The hospital was completely silent now. No lights, no movement visible through the windows. Whatever medical supplies they had been looking for were either gone or guarded by rooms full of infected. Dawn brought new sounds from the radio. Military units were reporting that containment zones were failing faster than they could be established. Major cities were being evacuated, but the evacuation routes were becoming clogged with refugees and infected alike. The phrase nationwide emergency was being used more frequently, along with instructions for civilians to shelter in place and avoid contact with anyone showing signs of infection. I was rationing my breakfast, trying to make my supplies last as long as possible, when I heard knocking on the truck's rear door. Not the frantic pounding of infected trying to get in, but deliberate, rhythmic knocking that could only come from someone who was still thinking clearly. A woman's voice called out, identifying herself as a nurse from the hospital and begging for help. Looking through the truck's small rear window, I could see 2 people standing behind my truck, A woman in blood-stained scrubs and a man in a security ball guard uniform, both looking exhausted but definitely still human. The woman was supporting the man who appeared to be injured, and they were both checking over their shoulders constantly for signs of infected. This was the moment Uncle Carlos had always warned me about. The moment when I would have to choose between helping strangers and protecting myself. The moment when compassion could get me killed, but refusing to help could cost me my humanity. As I reached for the door handle, I realized that the next few minutes would determine not just whether I survived, but what kind of person I would be in this new world that was taking shape around us. The woman knocked again, more urgently this time, and I could hear infected starting to moan in response to the noise. Whatever decision I made, I needed to make it fast, because staying indecisive was going to get all of us killed. I took a deep breath, checked that my grandmother's machete was within reach, and prepared to find out what survival really meant when the world ended, and everyone you thought you could trust might be willing to kill you for a can of beans. I opened that door and everything changed. The woman was Sarah Chen, a pediatric nurse I'd seen around the hospital but never served directly. The man with her was Tom Martinez, one of the security guards who had worked the night shift for as long as I'd been running my route. Tom was bleeding from his left shoulder, the fabric of his uniform torn and soaked with blood, but his eyes were clear and focused, not the blank white stare of the infected. Sarah helped Tom climb into the back of my truck, and I could see her medical training taking over as she immediately started assessing his wound. She moved with the kind of calm efficiency that only comes from years of dealing with emergencies, but I could see the fear in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. Tom was trying to act tough, but his face was pale, and he was sweating despite the cool morning air. The first thing I needed to know was whether Tom had been bitten. Sarah seemed to understand my concern without me having to ask directly. She carefully examined his shoulder wound while explaining that he'd been cut on broken glass while helping evacuate patients from the pediatric ward. The wound was jagged and deep, but it was clearly from glass, not teeth. Still, I kept my grandmother's machete within easy reach while Sarah worked on cleaning and bandaging the injury. Tom was more talkative once Sarah had given him some pain medication from the medical supplies she'd grabbed before leaving the hospital. He told me he'd been in the army for 8 years before taking the security job, deployed twice to Afghanistan, and that he'd never seen anything like what happened in that hospital. But when I asked him about his military experience, his answers became vague and he changed the subject quickly. Something about his discharge didn't sit right with me, but I figured everyone had secrets they didn't want to share. Sarah was easier to read. She'd been working the pediatric ward when the first infected patients arrived, and the trauma of what she'd witnessed was written all over her face. She kept talking about the children, how quickly the infection spread through the ward, how she'd had to make impossible choices about who to try to save. When she mentioned that she had family in Tucson, her voice broke slightly, and I could tell she was worried about people she cared about beyond just the immediate crisis. We spent the first few hours establishing ground rules for sharing the limited space in my truck. I made it clear that this was still my truck and my supplies, but that I was willing to share as long as everyone contributed to our survival. Sarah's medical knowledge was obviously valuable, and Tom's security training could help keep us safe, but I needed to know I could trust them before we went anywhere together. The radio chatter was getting worse throughout the morning. Reports were coming in from across the Southwest about hospitals being overrun, military checkpoints being abandoned, and entire neighborhoods going dark. Phoenix was falling apart faster than anyone had anticipated, and it was becoming clear that staying at the hospital was no longer an option. Tom insisted we avoid any military checkpoints, which struck me as odd, given his Army background. When I asked him why, he just said he knew how these operations worked and that desperate soldiers were just as dangerous as infected civilians. The way he said it made me think he'd seen military units break down under pressure before, but he wouldn't elaborate on where or when that might have happened. We decided our best option was to head to Miguel's food distribution warehouse on the south side of Phoenix. Miguel had been supplying my truck for years, and I knew he kept enough inventory to feed half the city for a week. If anywhere was going to have the food and supplies we needed to survive, it would be there. Plus, Miguel had always struck me as the kind of guy who would be prepared for emergencies, though I'd never asked him directly about his business practices. The truck's engine had been making strange noises since the previous day, probably from sitting idle for so long with the air conditioning running to keep the food fresh. I'd modified the truck over the years to be more self-sufficient, adding solar panels and a backup battery system, but the engine was still the original one from when I'd bought the truck used 12 years ago. Tom offered to take a look at it, claiming he'd learned some mechanical skills in the Army, though again he seemed reluctant to go into details about his service record. Before we left the hospital parking lot, I made sure everyone understood how dangerous the journey would be. The infected were attracted to noise and movement, which meant driving a large food truck through the city was going to draw attention from every direction. We needed to plan our route carefully, avoiding major roads where we might encounter other survivors who could be just as dangerous as the infected. Sarah suggested we listen to emergency medical frequencies to get updates on which areas of the city were still safe. Her radio knowledge was impressive for a pediatric nurse, and when I asked her about it, she mentioned that her father had been a ham radio operator who'd taught her about emergency communications. That kind of knowledge was going to be invaluable in a world where normal communication systems were breaking down. The first part of our journey took us through residential neighborhoods that looked almost normal from a distance. Houses with perfectly manicured lawns, cars parked in driveways, newspapers still lying on front steps. But as we got closer, you could see the signs of what had happened. Front doors left wide open, windows broken from the inside, dark stains on sidewalks that could have been anything but probably weren't. Tom was navigating using his knowledge of the city's back roads, trying to avoid areas where we might encounter large groups of infected or other survivors. His tactical thinking was clearly influenced by military training, but there was something about his approach that felt overly paranoid. He insisted we avoid not just military checkpoints but also any signs of organized survivor groups, which seemed like it might be cutting off potential sources of help. We passed an abandoned military checkpoint about halfway to the warehouse, and the scene there made my blood run cold. Vehicles were scattered across the road, some still burning, and there were bodies in military uniforms lying next to bodies of infected civilians. Tom barely glanced at the scene, but his jaw was clenched tight, and his hands were gripping his seat with white knuckles. Whatever had happened to end his military career, seeing American soldiers overwhelmed and killed was affecting him more than he wanted to admit. Sarah was monitoring the medical emergency frequencies, and the news she was hearing wasn't good. Hospitals across the region were either completely overrun or had been evacuated entirely. Medical personnel were being instructed to establish field treatment centers away from major population areas, but most of those were reporting being overwhelmed within hours of opening. The infection was spreading faster than anyone could treat it, and traditional medical responses were proving completely inadequate. The radio also picked up transmissions from other food trucks and mobile vendors who were still operating in the area. There was a taco truck operator named Carlos, who was coordinating with several other mobile food vendors to create a network of survivors who could share information and resources. The idea of joining up with other food service people appealed to me, since we understood each other's businesses and could trust each other's knowledge of supply sources. Tom was less enthusiastic about connecting with other survivor groups. He kept insisting that larger groups were harder to control and more likely to attract unwanted attention from both infected and hostile survivors. His paranoia was starting to worry me, especially since I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something important about his background. Sarah seemed to share my concerns, though she was too diplomatic to say anything directly. We reached the warehouse district as the sun was reaching its peak, and I could immediately see that the area hadn't been spared from the chaos. Several buildings were on fire, and there were abandoned cars scattered throughout the normally orderly streets. Miguel's warehouse was at the end of a dead-end street, which had always seemed like a disadvantage for deliveries but now looked like it might provide some security from random encounters. The warehouse itself looked intact from the outside, but the loading dock doors were standing open, which wasn't normal for Miguel's operation. He was always careful about security, partly because of the value of his inventory and partly because of some of his business associates who weren't always operating within legal boundaries. I'd always suspected that food distribution wasn't Miguel's only business, but I'd never asked questions because his prices were fair and his products were always fresh. Tom insisted on approaching the warehouse tactically, using the abandoned vehicles for cover while we assessed the situation. His military training was definitely useful here, but his approach felt overly aggressive for what should have been a simple supply run. Sarah and I followed his lead, but I could tell she was as uncomfortable with his paranoia as I was becoming. As we got closer to the warehouse, we could hear voices coming from inside. Multiple people talking in Spanish and English, some of them sounding angry or upset. There were definitely other survivors there, which could be good news if they were, friendly or very bad news if they weren't. Tom immediately assumed they would be hostile, but I pointed out that Miguel had always been fair in his business dealings and might be willing to share resources with people he knew. The voices were coming from the main warehouse floor, and, through the open loading dock, we could see several people moving around among the inventory shelves. Some of them were clearly loading supplies into vehicles, but they were doing it in an organized way that suggested they weren't just looting, randomly. One of the voices belonged to Miguel himself, which was a relief, but there were several other people with him that I didn't recognize. Sarah suggested we announce ourselves rather than trying to sneak up on them, pointing out that approaching armed survivors without warning was likely to get us shot. Tom disagreed, insisting that we needed to assess their intentions before revealing ourselves. The debate was becoming heated when one of the people in the warehouse spotted us and shouted for the others to come look. Within seconds, we were facing 5 armed survivors, including Miguel, who recognized me but didn't seem entirely happy to see me. The other 4 were clearly not people from his normal food distribution business. They looked like the kind of people Uncle Carlos had always warned me about, the ones who would take what they wanted when society's rules stopped applying. Miguel's expression suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with his new associates, either. The leader of the group introduced himself as Marcus, and it became clear very quickly that he knew about Miguel's side businesses that had nothing to do with food distribution. Marcus talked about old debts and business relationships in a way that made it obvious Miguel had been involved in activities that were definitely not legal. But Marcus also seemed to have his own group of survivors to look after, and he was more interested in securing supplies than settling old scores. The negotiation that followed was tense, with Tom becoming increasingly agitated as Marcus's group made it clear they considered the warehouse their territory now. Sarah tried to mediate, using her natural diplomatic skills to find common ground. But it was obvious that both groups needed the supplies in that warehouse to survive. The question was whether we could find a way to share resources without one group taking everything from the other. Marcus mentioned that his group had been in contact with other survivor communities, including rumors of a larger settlement forming in the mountains north of Phoenix. According to him, organized groups were starting to establish territories and trade networks, which meant individual survivors like us were going to need allies to have any chance of long-term survival. The problem was figuring out which potential allies could be trusted and which ones would betray us the first chance they got. Tom's fever was getting worse throughout the afternoon, though he was trying to hide it from everyone. Sarah noticed it too, and when she tried to check his temperature, he became defensive and aggressive in a way that seemed disproportionate to her concern. Something about his reaction set off alarm bells in my head, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what was wrong. The warehouse had enough supplies to keep both groups fed for weeks, assuming we could agree on how to divide everything fairly. But the negotiations were complicated by the fact that Marcus's group had vehicles better suited for transporting large quantities of supplies, while my food truck was better equipped for actually preparing and serving food. We needed each other, but neither group was willing to be completely vulnerable to the other. As evening approached, we agreed to spend the night at the warehouse and finalize our resource-sharing agreement in the morning. It seemed like the smart thing to do, since traveling at night would be more dangerous and we all needed rest after the stress of the past day, but Tom insisted on volunteering for the first watch, claiming his military experience made him the best choice for perimeter security. Looking back, I should have realized that someone running a fever shouldn't be trusted with everyone's safety during the night. But at the time, his offer seemed generous, and Sarah and I were exhausted from the stress of escaping the hospital and navigating through the city. Marcus's group set up their sleeping area on one side of the warehouse, while we claimed space near my truck on the other side. The last thing I remember before falling asleep was the sound of Tom checking and rechecking his equipment, muttering to himself about security protocols and potential threats. His behavior had been getting stranger throughout the day, but I attributed it to stress and his shoulder injury. Sarah had given him antibiotics for the wound, and we both expected him to be feeling better by morning. What we didn't expect was to wake up to screaming from Marcus's side of the warehouse, and the terrible realization that Tom was no longer the person we'd trusted with our lives. The infection timeline that Sarah had learned from the hospital radio reports was shorter than any of us had realized, and the symptoms weren't always as obvious as we'd thought. Tom's fever and increasing paranoia hadn't been side effects of his shoulder wound and the stress of survival. The screaming woke me up at what must have been around 3 a.m. Not the high-pitched scream of someone who was scared, but the deep guttural scream of someone fighting for their life. I grabbed my grandmother's machete and rolled out of my sleeping bag, trying to orient myself in the darkness of the warehouse. Sarah was already awake beside me, her medical training making her instantly alert to sounds of distress. The screaming was coming from Marcus's side of the warehouse, where his group had set up their sleeping area among the shelves of canned goods and dry supplies. I could hear multiple voices now, some shouting instructions, others crying out in pain or fear. But what made my blood run cold was the absence of Tom's voice among the chaos. He was supposed to be on watch, supposed to be protecting all of us from exactly this kind of situation. Sarah had a small flashlight that she'd taken from the hospital, and in its beam, we could see shapes moving between the warehouse shelves. But the movement was wrong, the same jerky, unnatural gait I'd seen in the hospital parking lot. Someone in Marcus's group had turned, and from the sound of it, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. We made our way carefully toward the commotion, using the warehouse shelves for cover and trying to stay quiet enough not to draw attention to ourselves. What we found was Marcus and 2 of his surviving group members backed against a wall, using improvised weapons to keep 3 infected at bay. The infected had been members of Marcus's group just hours before, but now they were relentlessly attacking their former companions with the same mindless hunger I'd witnessed at the hospital. The worst part was recognizing one of the infected as Tom. His security guard uniform was torn and blood-soaked, and his shoulder wound had reopened, but those weren't the details that made my stomach drop. It was his eyes, completely white and vacant, just like Dr. Patterson's had been. The fever and paranoia we'd attributed to stress and his injury had actually been the early stages of infection, and we'd been too naive to recognize the signs. Tom had been bitten at the hospital, probably during the initial chaos when he'd been helping evacuate patients. He'd hidden it from us either because he didn't realize what it meant or because he was hoping he could fight off the infection somehow. The shoulder wound from broken glass had been real, but it had concealed the bite marks underneath. Sarah's medical examination had been thorough, but she'd been looking for obvious bite wounds, not checking under existing injuries. Marcus was shouting for help while trying to fight off his infected former companions, but his improvised weapons weren't effective against enemies that felt no pain and had no fear of death. I realized we had a choice to make. We could try to help Marcus's group, risking our own lives in the process, or we could retreat to my truck and try to escape while the infected were distracted. Sarah made the decision for both of us. Her medical training and natural compassion overrode any thoughts of self-preservation, and she started moving toward Marcus's position with her flashlight to give them better visibility. I followed, her knowing that abandoning them would haunt me forever, but also knowing that getting involved in close combat with infected was likely to get us killed. The warehouse became a chaotic battlefield as we joined the fight. Marcus had managed to get his hands on a crowbar, which was much more effective than the bottles and cans his group had been using as weapons. Sarah stayed back with the flashlight, calling out warnings when infected approached from blind spots. I used my machete to take down Tom, and despite everything that had happened, having to kill someone I'd started to consider a friend was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. When the immediate fighting was over, We'd lost 3 people from Marcus's group and gained the knowledge that any of us could be infected without showing obvious symptoms. The warehouse that had seemed like a safe haven a few hours earlier now felt like a trap. We needed to get out, but we also needed to figure out how to trust each other when anyone could be carrying the infection. Marcus was furious about Tom's deception, but Sarah pointed out that Tom might not have known he was infected. The medical reports she'd heard at the hospital suggested that some people could carry the infection for longer periods before showing symptoms, and stress or injury could accelerate the process. Tom's military background might have given him the discipline to hide his symptoms longer than most people could have managed. The bigger problem was that we could no longer trust anyone's health status based solely on their appearance and behavior. If Tom could hide his infection until he turned, any of us could be infected without knowing it. We needed to establish protocols for monitoring each other's health, but we also needed to move quickly before the noise of our fight attracted more infected from the surrounding area. Marcus's remaining group consisted of himself and a woman named Lisa, who had been a nurse before the outbreak. Having 2 medical professionals in our group was reassuring, but it also meant we had more people to feed and protect. The warehouse had plenty of supplies, but it wasn't a defensible position for a long-term stay, and we had no way of knowing if other survivor groups might try to claim it for themselves. The radio chatter we'd been monitoring suggested that organized survivor groups were starting to form territories throughout the Phoenix area. Some of these groups were focused on mutual aid and resource sharing, but others were more like gangs, taking what they wanted from weaker groups. The warehouse's location made it valuable, but it also made it a target for anyone who knew about Miguel's supply operation. We spent the next several hours loading supplies into my truck and Marcus's vehicles, trying to take as much as possible while still maintaining mobility. The truck's storage capacity was limited, but I'd modified it over the years to maximize space efficiency. Marcus's group had a pickup truck and a van, both of which were better suited for transporting bulk supplies than people. Sarah suggested we head toward the mountains north of Phoenix, where Marcus had heard rumors of a larger survivor settlement. The higher elevation would provide better defensive positions, and the lower population density meant fewer infected to deal with. But it also meant leaving behind the urban infrastructure that had been supporting our survival so far. The conversation about our next destination revealed more about Marcus's background and connections. He'd been involved in various illegal activities before the outbreak, including smuggling operations that had given him detailed knowledge of backroads and hidden routes throughout Arizona. His criminal connections had also provided him with information about other survivor groups, including which ones were trustworthy and which ones were dangerous. Marcus warned us about several groups that had been engaging in raiding and kidnapping, taking supplies and people from weaker communities. According to his sources, these groups were being led by former military personnel who were using their training to dominate other survivors. The description made me think about Tom's paranoia about military checkpoints and his reluctance to discuss his service record. As we prepared to leave the warehouse, Lisa noticed that I was running a slight fever. The discovery sent everyone into a panic, with Marcus immediately suggesting that I should be isolated or abandoned to prevent the spread of infection. Sarah intervened, pointing out that stress and exhaustion could cause fever symptoms and that we needed to establish reasonable protocols for dealing with health concerns. The debate over my fever highlighted the impossible balance we were trying to maintain between caution and compassion. If we isolated or abandoned everyone who showed any sign of illness, we'd end up alone and vulnerable. But if we ignored potential infection symptoms, we could all end up like Marcus's group, fighting for our lives against people we'd trusted just hours before. Sarah's medical examination concluded that my fever was likely caused by dehydration and stress rather than infection, but she recommended that everyone monitor my condition closely over the next 24 hours. The incident established a precedent for how we would handle health concerns going forward, but it also created an undercurrent of suspicion that affected all our interactions. The warehouse loading process was complicated by the need to maintain security while moving supplies. The noise of our activities could attract infected from the surrounding area, and the open loading dock made us vulnerable to attack from multiple directions. Marcus's tactical knowledge was useful for establishing security protocols, but his criminal background made him paranoid about potential threats from other survivor groups. During the loading process, we discovered that Miguel had been storing more than just food supplies in his warehouse. Hidden among the legitimate inventory were weapons, ammunition, and other contraband that explained some of his questionable business associates. Marcus was familiar with Miguel's side businesses and knew how to access the hidden storage areas that contained the most valuable items. The weapons cache included several rifles, handguns, and boxes of ammunition, as well as body armor and other tactical equipment. Marcus explained that Miguel had been preparing for social unrest long before the outbreak, anticipating that economic collapse or civil disorder would eventually threaten his business operations. The discovery of these supplies significantly improved our group's defensive capabilities, but it also made us a more attractive target for other groups. Sarah was uncomfortable with the amount of firepower we were accumulating, but she acknowledged that the weapons might be necessary for protecting ourselves and the people we were trying to help. Her medical background had taught her to preserve life whenever possible, but the reality of our situation was that sometimes violence was the only way to prevent greater casualties. The radio monitoring during our warehouse stay revealed that the infection was spreading much faster than government officials had initially projected. Military containment efforts were failing across the Southwest, and civilian evacuation plans were being abandoned as transportation infrastructure broke down. The Federal Emergency Management Agency was reportedly establishing long-term shelter facilities in remote areas, but their locations were being kept secret to prevent them from being overrun by refugees. Marcus's criminal contacts had provided him with information about underground supply networks that were still operating, despite the collapse of normal commerce. These networks included smugglers, black market dealers, and other criminal organizations that had the infrastructure and connections to move goods across the region. Accessing these networks could provide us with supplies and information that weren't available through legitimate channels. The decision to leave the warehouse was ultimately forced by the arrival of infected attracted by the noise of our activities. They appeared at the loading dock entrance just as we were finishing loading our vehicles, and their presence made it clear that staying any longer would be extremely dangerous. We had to abandon some supplies that we couldn't carry, but we managed to escape with enough food, water, and equipment to sustain our group for several weeks. Our convoy consisted of my food truck, Marcus's pickup truck, and the van driven by Lisa. The food truck's size and weight made it the slowest vehicle, but it also provided the most protection and had the best communication equipment. We established radio protocols for maintaining contact between vehicles and coordinating our movements through potentially dangerous areas. The route north toward the mountains took us through suburban neighborhoods that showed increasing signs of abandonment and destruction. Many houses had been ransacked, either by fleeing residents trying to gather supplies or by other survivor groups looking for anything useful. The further we got from the city center, the more evidence we saw of small-scale conflicts between different groups of survivors. Sarah monitored emergency frequencies during our journey, trying to gather information about safe routes and potential hazards. The radio chatter painted a picture of a region in complete chaos, with isolated groups of survivors scattered throughout the area and no effective coordination between them. Government services had completely broken down, and emergency responders were either dead, infected, or focused on protecting their own families. Marcus's knowledge of back roads and hidden routes proved invaluable for avoiding major highways where we might encounter hostile groups or roadblocks. His criminal background had given him detailed familiarity with routes used for smuggling and other illegal activities, many of which were now the safest options for legitimate travelers trying to avoid detection. As we climbed into the foothills north of Phoenix, the landscape became more rugged and the roads more challenging for our vehicles. The food truck's weight and size made it difficult to navigate some of the steeper and more winding routes, but the improved visibility and defensive positions of the higher elevation made the difficult driving worthwhile. The mountain roads also provided us with better radio reception, allowing us to pick up transmissions from other survivor groups throughout the region. Some of these groups were requesting assistance or offering to trade supplies, while others were broadcasting warnings about hostile groups or infected hordes moving through specific areas. The information was valuable, but it also highlighted how isolated and vulnerable individual groups remained. We decided to establish a temporary camp at an abandoned rest area about halfway up the mountain road. The location provided good visibility of the approaches from below, and the existing infrastructure included restrooms, picnic areas, and a small building that could serve as a shelter. Most importantly, it was far enough from major population centers to reduce the risk of encountering large groups of infected. The camp setup revealed more about our group dynamics and individual strengths. Marcus's tactical knowledge was useful for establishing security perimeters and watch schedules, but his paranoia about potential threats was becoming increasingly problematic. Sarah's medical skills were essential for maintaining everyone's health, but her compassionate nature sometimes conflicted with the harsh realities of survival. Lisa's nursing background complemented Sarah's medical knowledge, but she was still traumatized by the loss of her friends at the warehouse. The evening discussion around our campfire focused on long-term survival strategies and the question of whether to continue searching for established survivor communities or try to establish our own settlement. Marcus argued for finding and joining a larger group, believing that numbers provided security and resources. Sarah preferred the idea of establishing a small, self-sufficient community that could help other survivors without becoming a target for hostile groups. The debate was interrupted by radio chatter indicating that infected were moving through the area below us in large numbers. The horde appeared to be following the main highway north, possibly attracted by the movement of other survivor groups or the noise of military vehicles. Our elevated position kept us safe for the moment, but it also made it clear that nowhere was truly secure in this new world. As we settled down for the night, with watch schedules established and our vehicles positioned for quick escape if necessary, I reflected on how much had changed in just 36 hours. We'd gone from individual survivors trying to find safety to a small group with shared resources and mutual dependencies. But Tom's betrayal had shown us that trust was a luxury we couldn't afford, and the challenges ahead would test every assumption we'd made about survival and human nature. The sound of the infected horde moving through the valley below us was a constant reminder that our current safety was temporary and fragile. Tomorrow would bring new decisions about where to go and who to trust, and the wrong choice could get us all killed. But for tonight we were alive, we were together, and we had enough supplies to face whatever came next. In a world where most people were already dead or worse, that was more than most survivors could hope for. The morning brought news that changed everything. Sarah was monitoring the emergency frequencies while I prepared breakfast on my truck's grill, and what she heard made her face go pale. The military evacuation center at Sky Harbor Airport had been overrun during the night. Thousands of refugees who had been waiting for transport to Federal Emergency Management Agency camps were now either dead or infected, and the zombie horde that resulted from that massacre was moving north through Phoenix, following the same route we'd taken to reach the mountains. Marcus immediately wanted to pack up and move higher into the mountains, but Lisa pointed out that we were running low on fuel and couldn't keep running forever. My food truck was particularly vulnerable because of its size and weight, and the mountain roads ahead were even more challenging than the ones we'd already navigated. We needed to make a decision about whether to find a defensible position and make a stand, or try to outrun a horde that numbered in the thousands. The radio chatter was painting a picture of complete societal collapse across the Southwest. Phoenix was burning, Tucson had gone dark, and even smaller cities like Flagstaff were reporting being overrun by infected. The Federal Emergency Management Agency camps that were supposed to provide safety for refugees were either falling or had already been abandoned by their military protectors. We were truly on our own now, with no government or military support to fall back on. Sarah's growing concern about our isolation led her to suggest that we try to make contact with the food truck network that Carlos had mentioned in his radio transmissions. The idea of connecting with other mobile vendors appealed to me, since we shared similar knowledge of supply sources and route planning. But Marcus was skeptical about revealing our location to strangers, especially when we had valuable supplies and weapons that other groups might want to take. The debate over whether to make radio contact was interrupted by the arrival of unexpected visitors. A family with 2 young children appeared on the road below our rest area, moving slowly and obviously exhausted. The parents were carrying heavy backpacks and the children looked like they hadn't eaten in days. They were exactly the kind of people Sarah's compassionate nature compelled her to help, but they were also the kind of burden that Marcus's survival instincts told him we couldn't afford. Lisa was the first to spot potential problems with helping the family. As a nurse, she'd learned to assess people quickly for signs of illness or injury, and she noticed that the father was limping badly, and the mother was supporting more of his weight than she should have been able to manage. More concerning was the fact that they were traveling during daylight hours when infected were more active, which suggested they might be running from something immediate rather than just seeking general safety. The family's name was the Hendersons, and their story was tragically typical of what was happening to civilian refugees throughout the region. They'd been living in a FEMA camp outside Tucson when it was overrun 3 days earlier. The father, David, had been injured during their escape, and they'd been walking north ever since, hoping to reach relatives in Colorado. The children, a boy about 8 and a girl maybe 6 years old, were clearly traumatized and hadn't spoken since leaving the camp. David's injury was more serious than it had initially appeared. When Sarah examined his leg, she found an infected bite wound that he'd been hiding under bandages and torn clothing. He'd been bitten during the camp evacuation, but he'd concealed it from his family because he knew they wouldn't survive on their own. The infection timeline suggested he had maybe 12 hours before he turned, and his wife Karen had no idea what was coming. The discovery of David's bite wound created an immediate crisis for our group. Marcus wanted to drive the family away immediately, arguing that we couldn't risk David turning and attacking the children or anyone else. Sarah insisted that we had a moral obligation to help, especially since the children were innocent victims, who had done nothing wrong. Lisa supported Sarah's position, but wanted to isolate David to minimize the risk to everyone else. Karen's reaction to learning about her husband's infection was heartbreaking. She'd suspected something was wrong, but had been afraid to ask directly because she knew what the answer might mean. The children didn't understand the medical details, but they could sense the adult tension and fear, which made them even more withdrawn and scared. We had less than a day to figure out what to do with a family that was about to lose its father to a zombie transformation. The debate over helping the Hendersons revealed fundamental philosophical differences within our group. Marcus's criminal background had taught him that sentiment was a luxury that got people killed, and he viewed the family as a liability that would slow us down and attract unwanted attention. Sarah's medical training emphasized preserving life and helping the vulnerable, even at personal risk. Lisa was caught between practical concerns and moral obligations, understanding both perspectives, but unable to choose between them. My own position was complicated by memories of Uncle Carlos's warnings about how quickly civilized people would turn on each other when resources became scarce. The family needed help that we could provide, but helping them would use up supplies and time that we might need for our own survival. The children's presence would also make our group more visible and slower moving, which could attract both infected and hostile survivor groups. The decision was ultimately forced by the arrival of more infected in the area. The noise of our discussion and the children's occasional crying had attracted attention from individual zombies that were scattered throughout the foothills. These weren't part of the main horde moving north from Phoenix, but they were a sign that nowhere was truly safe from the infection. We needed to move quickly, and bringing the family would make that much more difficult. David made the choice for all of us. When he realized how much his infection was complicating our survival plans, he asked me privately to make sure his family was taken care of after he was gone. He knew he was going to turn, and he didn't want that to happen while his children were watching. We agreed that when the transformation began, I would take him away from the others and do what needed to be done, sparing his family the trauma of seeing their father become a monster. The practical arrangements for caring for Karen and the children were complicated by our limited resources and mobility requirements. The food truck could accommodate extra passengers, but it would be crowded and would use fuel and supplies faster. More importantly, children's needs for food, water, and rest were different from adults, and their emotional needs for security and stability were impossible to meet in our current situation. Sarah took charge of explaining the situation to the children in terms they could understand, without traumatizing them further. Her pediatric nursing experience was invaluable for communicating with kids who had already experienced more horror than most adults could handle. She told them that their father was very sick and might have to go to a special hospital, but that the rest of us would take care of them no matter what happened. Marcus was becoming increasingly agitated about the delays and complications that helping the family was creating. His contacts in the criminal underworld had taught him to recognize when situations were becoming uncontrollable, and he was worried that our group was making too many emotional decisions instead of practical ones. The radio chatter he was monitoring suggested that hostile survivor groups were becoming more organized and aggressive, which meant that obvious targets like our convoy would need to be increasingly careful about avoiding detection. The afternoon brought David's transformation, which happened faster than Sarah's medical knowledge had predicted. The stress of traveling and hiding his condition had apparently accelerated the infection timeline, and he began showing the characteristic fever and disorientation that preceded the final change. Karen realized what was happening before David did, and her attempt to say goodbye to her husband was one of the most heartbreaking things I'd ever witnessed. Taking David away from his family to handle his transformation was the hardest thing I'd had to do since this whole nightmare began. He was still partially aware when we walked into the woods away from our camp, and he asked me to tell his children that he loved them and to make sure they remembered him as he had been, not as what he was becoming. Using my grandmother's machete to end his suffering before he could hurt anyone was an act of mercy, but it still felt like murder. Karen's grief after losing David was overwhelming, but she managed to control it enough to avoid alarming the children. Lisa's nursing experience helped her provide emotional support, while Sarah focused on the practical aspects of caring for two traumatized kids in a survival situation. The children understood that their father was gone, but they were too young to fully grasp the permanence of death or the horror of what he might have become. The presence of the children changed our group dynamics in ways that none of us had anticipated. Their need for routine and security conflicted with our need for mobility and flexibility. Their vulnerability made us all more protective and risk-averse, but it also made us more visible and slower moving. Most importantly, their innocence served as a constant reminder of what we were fighting to preserve in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything good and human. Marcus's patience with our expanded group was wearing thin, and he started making comments about the practical impossibility of protecting children in our current situation. His suggestions that we find a more established settlement where Karen and the kids could be cared for by others were reasonable, but they also sounded like excuses to abandon people who needed our help. Sarah and Lisa were both opposed to splitting up the group, arguing that we were stronger together than apart. The radio transmissions from Carlos's food truck network became more frequent and better organized as the day progressed. Other mobile vendors throughout Arizona and New Mexico were coordinating supply runs, sharing information about safe routes, and establishing temporary meeting points for mutual aid. The network was exactly the kind of community support system that could help us care for the children while maintaining our mobility and independence. My decision to make contact with the food truck network was influenced by practical considerations as much as moral ones. We needed access to fuel, supplies, and information that individual groups couldn't provide for themselves. The children's presence made us more vulnerable to hostile groups, but it also made us more sympathetic to potential allies who shared our values about protecting the innocent. Carlos's network seemed to understand that survival required cooperation as well as self-reliance. The initial radio contact with Carlos revealed that his network had been monitoring our transmissions and was aware of our general location. Several other food trucks were operating in our area, and they'd been discussing whether to make contact with us. Our reputation for helping other survivors had spread through the informal communication networks that were developing among different groups, which was both reassuring and concerning. Marcus was opposed to revealing too much information about our capabilities and resources to the food truck network, arguing that advertising our weapons and supplies would make us targets for raiders and hostile groups. His criminal background had taught him to be suspicious of anyone who seemed too eager to help, and he worried that Carlos's network might be a front for more predatory organizations. Sarah disagreed, pointing out that isolation was just as dangerous as cooperation in our current situation. The evening discussion about whether to join Carlos's network was complicated by reports of increased raider activity in our area. Several Survivor groups had been attacked by organized bands of former military personnel who were using their training and equipment to dominate weaker communities. These raiders were reportedly kidnapping useful specialists like medical personnel and mechanics while killing or abandoning anyone they considered a burden. Lisa's nursing background made her particularly vulnerable to kidnapping by raiders who needed medical expertise. Sarah's pediatric training was also valuable, especially to groups that included children or pregnant women. Even my food service experience was potentially attractive to raiders who needed someone to manage food supplies in preparation for large groups. Marcus pointed out that advertising our skills through radio networks was like painting targets on our backs. The night brought more evidence that we were being watched or tracked by unknown groups. Marcus noticed vehicle lights moving on roads below our position, following patterns that suggested reconnaissance rather than random travel. The movements were too coordinated to be individual survivors, but they didn't match the chaotic wandering of infected hordes. Someone was conducting surveillance of our area, possibly planning an attack or robbery. Sarah's monitoring of emergency frequencies revealed increased chatter about organized raider groups operating throughout the region. These groups were using military tactics and equipment to overwhelm survivor communities, taking what they wanted and leaving destruction behind. Several established settlements had been wiped out completely, with no survivors left to report what had happened. The pattern suggested that raiders were becoming more aggressive and better organized as time went on. The decision to move during the night was forced by the discovery of fresh tire tracks near our rest area. Someone had been close enough to our camp to conduct detailed reconnaissance, but they'd been careful not to reveal themselves or their intentions. Marcus's tactical experience suggested that this was preparation for an attack, and that waiting until morning would give our watchers time to organize and position themselves for maximum advantage. Packing up our camp in darkness while maintaining security was challenging, especially with two frightened children who didn't understand why we had to leave in such a hurry. Karen was struggling with her own grief and exhaustion, but she managed to help keep the kids calm while we loaded our vehicles. The food truck's size made it impossible to conceal our movement, but the mountain roads provided multiple route options that might allow us to avoid whoever was tracking us. The convoy's night movement through unfamiliar mountain roads was treacherous, but Marcus's knowledge of back routes and my truck's GPS navigation system helped us avoid the most dangerous obstacles. Sarah monitored radio frequencies for any indication that our movements were being tracked or reported by hostile groups. Lisa kept watch over Karen and the children, trying to provide reassurance while remaining alert for potential threats. The radio contact with Carlos's network during our night travel revealed that other food trucks in the area had also noticed increased raider activity. Several vendors had been forced to abandon their regular routes and were coordinating defensive measures through encrypted radio channels. The network was evolving from a loose association of individual operators into something resembling an organized resistance movement. As dawn approached, we found ourselves in a narrow mountain valley with limited escape routes and excellent defensive positions. The location was isolated enough to avoid casual detection, but it also left us vulnerable if enemies managed to locate our position. The trade-off between security and mobility was becoming more critical as threats from both infected and hostile humans continued to increase. The morning would bring new decisions about whether to continue running from unknown pursuers or find a place to make a stand with the resources and allies we had available. The children's presence complicated every tactical consideration, but it also reminded us what we were fighting to protect in a world where humanity itself seemed to be disappearing. Whatever happened next, we would face it together, as a group that had chosen compassion over convenience and cooperation over pure self-interest. The morning of our third day brought radio chatter that made everything clear. Carlos's food truck network had intercepted communications from the raider group that had been tracking us. They weren't just random criminals looking for easy targets. They were former military contractors led by someone calling himself Colonel Morrison, and they'd been systematically hunting down anyone with useful skills or valuable resources. Medical personnel, mechanics, food service operators, anyone who could help sustain a large group was being kidnapped or forced to join their operation. Sarah's pediatric nursing skills had put her on their priority list, along with Lisa's general nursing background and my food distribution knowledge. The raiders had been monitoring radio transmissions throughout the region, identifying potential targets and gathering intelligence before launching coordinated attacks. Our convoy had been marked for capture, not destruction, which explained why they'd been following us instead of attacking immediately. Marcus's paranoia about the food truck network suddenly made more sense when Carlos revealed that 2 of the vendors in his network had already been captured by Morrison's raiders. The attacks had happened within the past week, and both vendors had been taken alive along with their vehicles and supplies. The raiders were building something larger than just a survival group. They were creating a feudal system where useful people served as essentially slaves while Morrison's inner circle controlled all the resources and weapons. The revelation about the raiders' organized intelligence gathering made me realize how naive we'd been about operational security. Every radio transmission we'd made had potentially revealed information about our location, capabilities, and vulnerabilities. Our discussions about helping the Henderson family had advertised our medical personnel and our willingness to take risks for humanitarian reasons. Morrison's people had been building detailed profiles of survivor groups throughout the region, and we'd been unwittingly providing them with targeting information. Carlos's network had developed countermeasures against the raiders, including encrypted communication protocols and coordinated defensive strategies. But their primary tactic was mobility, staying ahead of raider reconnaissance and avoiding confrontation whenever possible. The network operated more like a guerrilla resistance movement than a traditional business association, which was exactly what survival required in a world where organized predators were hunting anyone who possessed useful skills or resources. The immediate problem was that our convoy was too visible and too slow to effectively evade Morrison's raiders. My food truck was particularly vulnerable because of its size and distinctive appearance, and the presence of children made it impossible for us to travel quickly or quietly. Marcus suggested splitting up the group, with him and Lisa taking one route while Sarah, Karen, the children, and I took another. The idea made tactical sense, but it also meant abandoning the mutual support that had kept us alive so far. Sarah was opposed to splitting up the group, arguing that our combined skills and resources made us stronger than we would be as separate units. Her medical expertise was more valuable when combined with Lisa's nursing background, and Marcus's tactical knowledge was most effective when he had people to protect and organize. The children's presence complicated everything, but abandoning them or Karen was not something any of us could morally justify. The radio discussions with Carlos's network revealed that several other food trucks were operating in our general area, and they were willing to coordinate a joint defensive operation if Morrison's raiders attempted to attack any of their members. The network had learned that raiders were vulnerable to coordinated resistance, especially when they encountered more opposition than they'd expected, based on their intelligence gathering. Multiple food trucks working together could provide mutual support while maintaining mobility. Lisa's suggestion that we use our medical supplies as bait for a trap initially seemed too dangerous to consider, but Marcus's tactical analysis revealed that the raiders' priority targets were medical personnel and their supplies, which meant they would take significant risks to capture someone with Sarah and Lisa's capabilities. If we could make ourselves appear vulnerable while actually being prepared for an attack, we might be able to turn the raiders' hunting strategy against them. The plan that emerged from our discussions was risky but potentially effective. We would use my food truck as obvious bait, traveling on main roads where the raiders could easily find us, while Marcus and other members of Carlos's network positioned themselves for ambush attacks. The children's presence would make us appear more vulnerable and valuable, since raiders would assume that people caring for kids wouldn't be prepared for serious combat. Karen's reaction to learning that her children would be used as bait for a military operation was exactly what you'd expect from any parent. She was terrified, angry, and absolutely opposed to putting her kids at additional risk after everything they'd already been through. But Sarah explained that the alternative was to keep running indefinitely, while the raiders' intelligence network tracked our movements and eventually cornered us anyway. At least this plan gave us some control over when and where a confrontation would happen. The coordination with Carlos's network required revealing our exact location and movement plans, which went against every survival instinct Marcus had developed during his criminal career. But the alternative was to face Morrison's raiders alone, which was essentially suicide given their military training and superior numbers. Carlos had been building his network specifically to deal with threats like organized raider groups, and his vendors had been sharing intelligence and resources for weeks. The radio communications with other food trucks revealed that Morrison's operation was larger and more sophisticated than we'd initially realized. He'd been recruiting former military personnel throughout the Southwest, offering them security and resources in exchange for their combat skills and tactical knowledge. The group had captured several government supply depots and had been systematically raiding survivor communities to build up their stockpile of weapons, vehicles, and useful personnel. Sarah's medical assessment of our group's readiness for combat was sobering. None of us except Marcus had significant weapons training, and even his experience was more focused on small-scale criminal activities than military-style operations. Lisa had basic first aid skills, but treating combat injuries would be very different from the hospital nursing she was used to. Karen was completely untrained and would be focused entirely on protecting her children during any fighting. The weapons we'd taken from Miguel's warehouse were more than adequate for our defensive needs, but knowing how to use them effectively under stress was a different matter entirely. Marcus spent several hours providing basic firearms training to Sarah, Lisa, and me, but there's only so much you can learn in one afternoon. The most important lessons were about safety protocols and avoiding accidents that could be more dangerous than enemy fire. The positioning of Carlos's network for our planned ambush required careful coordination of timing and communication. 3 other food trucks would be stationed along the route where we expected the raiders to intercept us, with hidden positions that would allow them to attack the raiders from multiple directions simultaneously. The key was making sure that everyone involved understood their roles and responsibilities during what would likely be a chaotic and fast-moving situation. My role as bait meant that I would be driving the food truck along a predetermined route, while monitoring radio communications for updates on raider movements. Sarah would be with me to provide medical support and to make our convoy appear to include the high-value targets that Morrison's people were specifically hunting. Karen and the children would be in the truck's rear compartment, protected by its armored walls but ready to evacuate quickly if the situation went badly. The morning of our planned operation brought unexpected complications when radio intercepts revealed that Morrison's raiders had captured another member of Carlos's network during the night. The vendor's truck had been taken intact, along with its communication equipment and any intelligence about our defensive plans. We had to assume that the raiders now knew about our ambush and would be prepared for coordinated resistance. Marcus wanted to abort the operation and return to simple evasion tactics, but Carlos argued that running would only delay the inevitable confrontation, while giving the raiders more time to gather intelligence and recruit additional personnel. The network had been planning for this kind of situation, and they had backup protocols for dealing with compromised operations. The key was adapting our tactics to account for what the raiders might know. The revised plan involved multiple potential ambush sites and more complex coordination between network members. Instead of a single trap, we would create a series of opportunities for attacking the raiders while maintaining mobility and flexibility. If one ambush site was compromised or avoided, we could shift to alternative positions and continue the operation. The goal was to inflict enough casualties on Morrison's group to discourage them from continuing their hunting activities in our area. Sarah's monitoring of emergency medical frequencies revealed that the raiders had been using captured medical personnel to treat their own injured members, which explained why they were so focused on kidnapping healthcare workers. But the radio chatter also suggested that their medical resources were being stretched by casualties from previous operations, which meant they might be more desperate than usual to capture new personnel. The waiting period before the planned operation was nerve-wracking for everyone involved. Karen spent most of her time with the children, trying to keep them calm and distracted, while adult conversations focused on combat tactics and casualty planning. Lisa reviewed her medical supplies and prepared for treating potential injuries to our own people. Marcus checked and rechecked weapons and communication equipment while monitoring radio frequencies for any sign of raider movements. The first indication that our plan was working came when radio intercepts revealed raider communications about tracking our convoy's movement. They were discussing approach tactics and personnel assignments, confirming that they intended to capture, rather than kill the occupants of my food truck. Their focus on taking prisoners alive would give us tactical advantages, since they would be more cautious about using destructive weapons that might damage valuable assets. The initial contact happened exactly where we'd expected it, on a mountain highway with limited visibility and multiple potential ambush positions. 2 raider vehicles approached my food truck from behind, using standard law enforcement tactics that suggested professional training. They were trying to conduct what appeared to be a routine traffic stop, probably hoping to take us by surprise, before we could resist or call for help. My response to the raiders' approach followed the script we'd developed with Carlos's network. I maintained normal driving speed while Sarah used our radio to alert the other food trucks about the contact. The goal was to draw the raiders into the ambush zone where our allies were waiting, while avoiding any actions that might make them suspicious about our preparedness. We needed them to believe they were dealing with easy targets until it was too late for them to escape. The ambush itself was more successful than any of us had dared to hope. Carlos's network had positioned their vehicles perfectly to catch the raiders in a crossfire, while my truck's armored rear compartment protected Karen and the children from stray bullets. The raiders' focus on capturing rather than killing their targets made them vulnerable to aggressive tactics, and their surprise at encountering organized resistance disrupted their coordination. Marcus's tactical leadership during the fighting was impressive, coordinating our defensive fire while maintaining communication with the other food trucks. Sarah's medical training proved valuable for treating injuries to network members who were wounded during the engagement. Lisa's nursing background helped her assist with casualty care, while Karen focused entirely on keeping the children safe and calm, despite the chaos around them. The aftermath of the successful ambush revealed important intelligence about Morrison's operation. The captured raider vehicles contained detailed maps showing the locations of other survivor communities, along with personnel files on individuals. The raiders had been tracking for potential recruitment or elimination. The information confirmed that Morrison's group was much larger and more organized than most survivor communities realized. The most disturbing discovery was evidence that Morrison's raiders had been in contact with similar groups operating in other states. The zombie outbreak hadn't just created isolated pockets of survivors struggling to rebuild civilization. It had also enabled the rise of predatory organizations that viewed the collapse of government authority as an opportunity to establish their own feudal territories through violence and intimidation. Sarah's examination of the raider intelligence files revealed that our group had been under surveillance for longer than we'd realized. Morrison's people had detailed information about our individual backgrounds, our group dynamics, and our resource capabilities. They'd been planning our capture since before we'd left the warehouse, which meant our operational security had been compromised from the very beginning of our association. The radio communications intercepts from the raider vehicles provided valuable intelligence about Morrison's main base of operations and his plans for expanding his territory. The information suggested that several other food truck operators and medical personnel in the region were also being targeted for capture. Carlos's network immediately began sharing this intelligence with other survivor groups to help them prepare for potential attacks. Marcus's analysis of the captured raider equipment revealed that Morrison's group had access to military-grade weapons and communication systems that most survivor communities couldn't match. The implications were sobering, since it meant that even successful defensive operations like ours might only delay rather than prevent eventual confrontation with better-equipped enemies. The regional balance of power was shifting toward groups with military experience and captured government resources. The decision to share our intelligence with other survivor networks was controversial within our group, since it meant revealing information that could potentially be used against us by hostile groups. But Sarah argued that cooperation was essential for long-term survival, and that isolated communities would eventually be overwhelmed by organized predators, regardless of their individual defensive capabilities. The establishment of regular communication protocols with Carlos's food truck network marked a turning point in our survival strategy. Instead of simply trying to evade threats while searching for safe havens, we were becoming part of a larger resistance movement that was actively working to counter the rise of predatory groups like Morrison's Raiders. The network was evolving from a loose association of individual vendors into something resembling a mobile community, with shared resources and mutual defense obligations. Karen's adjustment to our new role in Carlos's network was difficult, since it meant accepting that her children would be growing up in a world where combat operations and military tactics were part of normal life. But Sarah's pediatric expertise helped her understand that children were remarkably adaptable, and that providing them with community support and security was more important than shielding them from the realities of their new world. The radio. Contact with Uncle Carlos, who had been monitoring our transmissions from his rural property outside Tucson, provided both personal reassurance and strategic intelligence. His paranoid preparations for social collapse had proven remarkably prescient, and his isolated location had kept him safe from both infected hordes and raider groups. More importantly, his property could serve as a secure base for network operations in southern Arizona. The coordination between Carlos's food truck network and Uncle Carlos's rural stronghold created opportunities for establishing more permanent infrastructure while maintaining operational mobility. The network could use his property for resupply and equipment maintenance while continuing to provide mobile support for survivor communities throughout the region. The combination of mobility and secure bases was exactly what long-term resistance operations required. Sarah's growing role as a regional medical coordinator for the network reflected the reality that specialized skills were becoming more valuable as survivor communities became more organized. Her pediatric expertise was particularly important for communities that included children, and her experience with our group's defensive operations made her valuable for training other medical personnel in combat casualty care. The evening radio communications with other network members revealed that Morrison's raider group had been significantly weakened by our successful ambush and similar operations conducted by other survivor communities. Several of his key personnel had been killed or captured, and his recruitment efforts were being hampered by increased awareness of his tactics among potential targets. The tide was beginning to turn in favor of defensive cooperation over predatory aggression. The establishment of regular supply routes between network members created opportunities for specialization and trade that improved everyone's survival prospects. My food service expertise became valuable for coordinating meal planning and nutrition management across multiple communities, while other vendors contributed their own specialized knowledge of mechanics, electronics, and other essential skills. The network was beginning to resemble a functioning economy rather than just a mutual defense alliance. The 3 days that had passed since the outbreak began seemed like months given everything we'd experienced and learned. The world we'd known was gone forever. But the community we'd helped build through Carlos's network offered hope that something better could emerge from the chaos. The children's laughter during our evening meal reminded us that humanity's future depended on our ability to cooperate and protect the innocent, even when faced with threats that seemed overwhelming. The radio reports of similar networks forming in other regions suggested that our experience wasn't unique, and that survivor communities throughout the country were beginning to organize effective resistance against both infected hordes and predatory human groups. The zombie outbreak had destroyed the old world, but it was also creating opportunities for building new communities based on cooperation, mutual aid, and shared survival, rather than competition and exploitation. The plans being discussed for the coming weeks included expanding the network's territory, establishing more secure bases, and developing better communication links with other survivor groups throughout the Southwest. The goal was to create a regional alliance that could provide security and resources for anyone willing to contribute to the common good, while maintaining the mobility and flexibility that had kept us alive during the initial chaos. The 72 hours since the outbreak began had taught us that survival required more than just individual preparedness and self-reliance. It demanded cooperation, trust, and willingness to take risks for people we barely knew. The community we'd built wasn't perfect, and the threats we faced were far from over, but we'd proven that ordinary people could adapt to extraordinary circumstances when they worked together toward common goals.